Narcissists in Literature, J. Gatsby. Hello, I'm HG Tudor. We narcissists are fascinating folk. Of course, if you're involved with us in an entanglement, it's far from fascinating. But once you've removed yourself from it and recovered and achieved your freedom, there are many that take an almost academic interest in the subject matter of the narcissist and the various behaviours, manipulations, and the narcissistic dynamic. The behaviour of the narcissist invariably beggars belief for many individuals, and once they've gone down the rabbit hole with regard to their pursuit of understanding, they realise that they've been involved with many narcissists in their life, that they start to spot narcissists around them, and also start to see the representation of narcissists in famous and well-known people, and in particular amongst film, television, poetry, and literature. And therefore, as part of this, I'm from time to time going to examine well-known narcissists that have appeared in literature to help you understand more that these characters are indeed narcissists and the reasons why. You may well have had your own suspicions about these particular characters and thought, I think they're a narcissist. Well, are they? Naturally, you can utilise from the Knowledge Vault Know the Narcissist, where you can find out if somebody is a narcissist, where they're well known, and also their school and cadre if they are. Similarly, if you suspect they're an empath, you can use Show Me the Empath. And I'd encourage you to utilise those as means of learning more. But here we have an in-depth analysis of J. Gatsby that comes from the novel, The Great Gatsby, written by the American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald. I dare say many of you have read the book, and certainly many of you will have seen the film that starred Leonardo DiCaprio. It's important to make this point about narcissists that appear on film, in television, and in novels. They don't always completely fit with the aspects of a narcissist, but you often have a best fit. The reason for this is that with certain depictions, because of the necessity of entertainment, character arc, story arc, and generally speaking that many producers of this content want to have the old redemption or happy ending or feel-good outcome, there are certain aspects of the character, the way that they are written and played, that doesn't fully accord with the narcissist. So, for example, there's a film, the name of which escapes me at the moment, whereby there was an individual who was engaged in identity theft. She was completely callous, self-absorbed, self-centered, almost a caricature of a narcissist. She stole people's identities and then went out and partied hard on the basis of racking up rather large bills and paying for it, utilizing the credit that she had stolen from various people. She then had one of her victims track her down and ultimately ended up in prison, but had a moment of redemption whereby she stopped doing what she did and she realized that she wasn't going to continue to behave that way, and she redeemed herself. Prior to this moment, she showed all the hallmarks of a narcissist. I don't need to go through those different ways, but it's important to realise that they were demonstrated. And then that was all shattered by the fact that she had this road to Damascus moment of recognition, realisation, and then redemption. That would not fit with a narcissist. Of course, that was included because the audience wants to believe that there's good in everybody, and that notwithstanding how awful, how self-centered, how nasty an individual can be, that with the right input and guidance, and maybe just some love, they can redeem themselves. Therefore, it's important to understand that in this analysis of narcissists in literature, there will be aspects that won't necessarily always quite fit, and that's driven by the necessity of character development, story arc, character arc, and of course the necessity of certain outcomes to please the audience and the reader. Keep that in mind. But now we're going to examine J. Gatsby from The Great Gatsby. It's a 1925 novel which was set in the Jazz Age on Long Island near New York City. The novel depicts first-person narrator Nick Carraway's interactions with mysterious millionaire Jay Gatsby and Gatsby's obsession to reunite with his former lover, Daisy Buchanan. The novel's title has the look of early 20th century posters that advertise shows by performers who appear to work miracles, acts of daring, or even magic, and they're often advertised as the great this or the great that, for instance, the great Houdini. Jay Gatsby is advertised by his author as the Great Gatsby, like some kind of performer of impossible feats, an illusionist. And that's what Gatsby is. The narcissist illusionist. As you know, the narcissist spins an illusion to the world of what they are, and Gatsby certainly does so. He doesn't exist in the kind of world that most people would regard as that collective reality. In fact, he operates in a fantasy world of his own creation, driven by his narcissism, and he does that in pursuit of his dream, albeit an unrealistic one. He is consumed with his own image and reputation, and he shows the drive of particular narcissists to do whatever it takes to maintain his position in society, because status is so important to him as it enables him to pursue the prime aims. He throws lavish parties, grandiosity in terms of generosity to cause people to like him and be under control, and also for people to notice that, so that he's talked about receiving fuel. He also does this in an attempt to triangulate with Daisy to win her back, albeit those efforts turn to be out in vain. Throughout the novel, Gatsby has an obsession with Daisy. Now, ordinarily, a narcissist might not show that same level of obsession, whereby if an appliance proves difficult, they'll just move on to another one, because there are others. But of course, as part of a story, there is the necessity of him keep returning. And therefore, the way to look at it with regard to his narcissism is that she keeps coming back upon his radar, that she appears, and therefore that compels him to assert control over her. And he does so repeatedly, in order to bring her back under control. He regularly lies, he regularly manipulates, and he doesn't show any regard for the feelings or well-being of others, underpinning his absence of emotional empathy. Jay Gatsby is a young man, around 30 years old, and he rose from an impoverished childhood in rural North Dakota to become fabulously wealthy. Wealth is important to certain narcissists, particularly those of a somatic and elite nature. He achieved his lofty goal by participating in organized crime, demonstrating an absence of emotional empathy for those that is affected, a lack of accountability by being a lawbreaker, a sense of entitlement to do what he wants. This involved distributing illegal alcohol, and he traded in stolen securities. That demonstrates an absence of boundary recognition. From his early youth, Gatsby despised poverty, a threat to his control, and he wanted wealth and sophistication. He dropped out of St. Olaf's College after only 2 weeks because he couldn't bear the janitorial job with which he was paying his tuition. That demonstrates a lack of accountability. Failure to stick at the job is also his deluded view that he's better than that. He'd always wanted to be rich, but whilst being rich would allow the pursuit of the prime aims, in this particular story, it's fundamentally important because it's the means by which he's able to control or seek to control Daisy Buchanan, who he met as a young military officer in Louisville before leaving to fight in World War I in 1917. Daisy projects an aura of luxury, grace, and charm. All of that is seen through the lens of being painted white, and those prove to be character traits that Gatsby wants to acquire. In order to do so, Gatsby lied to Buchanan about his own background in order to convince her that he was good enough for her. She promised to wait for him when he left for the war, but instead she married Tom Buchanan in 1919, which of course is a threat to control. And she did this while Gatsby was studying at Oxford after the war in an attempt to gain an education. Thereafter, Gatsby dedicated himself to winning Daisy back, and his acquisition of millions of dollars, his purchase of a gaudy mansion on West Egg, and his lavish weekly parties are simply a means to trying to win her back, whilst at the same time controlling lots of people and drawing fuel from them, and managing this facade of being hugely successful, of being generous and a party-loving individual. Gatsby is in effect two different individuals. As a teenager, he's James Gatz, and then becomes Jay Gatsby. They both behave in an obsessional way which is linked to the need for control. The young James Gatz, before even meeting Daisy, the object of his adult obsession, devoted himself to a single-minded program that was relentless in relation to self-improvement. This is part of that need for control. After Gatsby's death, his father appears and shows Nick a schedule written by the young Jimmy. 6 a.m, rise from bed. 6:15 to 6:30, dumbbell exercise and wall scaling. 7:15 to 8:15, study electricity, etc. 8:30 to 4:30 p.m, work. 4:30 to 5, baseball and sports. 5 to 6, practice elocution, poise, and how to achieve it. 7 till 9, study needed inventions. General resolves: no wasting time at shafters. No more smoking or chewing. Bath every other day. Read one improving book or magazine per week. Save $5, which is then crossed out, $3 per week. Be better to parents. This wasn't just a program of self-discipline. It was a complete renewal, the invention of a new person, which is what a narcissist does. You will have seen, for instance, the numerous instances of this one's wife as she seeks to reinvent herself. The narcissist is a chameleon, portraying themselves as being different individuals to different people, which enables them to get to the prime aims. The absence of a solid core of identity means that it is very easy for the narcissist to shift into these different personas. And here we see the instance whereby Jay Gatsby is created as a renewed version of his old self. Nick Carraway describes him: the truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, grandiosity, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, as in the Almighty, which again demonstrates the oft-held view by the narcissist that they are somehow an agent of the Almighty, a deliverer of holy justice, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. Thus, Jay Gatsby was part of the construct that was created by the narcissism to show to the outside world this particular individual to pursue the prime aims. He was created from the imagination of Jimmy Gatz, in terms of that's what he would imagine it'd be like to be a wealthy man. That the construct took aspects of other people, shards, fragments, and pieces, and moulded them together to create Jay Gatsby as the idea driven by a narcissist to what a wealthy man looks like. For instance, if you look at his mansion, it is the appearance of how a teenager would envisage the mansion of a rich man to be. That it has all the trimmings of wealth, it's ostentatious, it's grand. But it's only there for the purposes of trying to ensnare Daisy. On his return from service in the war, discovering that Daisy has married Tom, Gatsby's life has been in an unwavering drive to ensure that he's wealthy, so that he is then able to use that wealth to advance his social level, thus making it easier for him to control her. And he shows that unwavering pursuit that certain narcissists will adopt in order to achieve control by using every method that he can, which includes his immersion in organised crime, demonstrating the absence of any moral compass and the necessity of taking such steps to get what he requires. Every single thing that he does, from whether it's having huge parties, to the items that he buys, for instance his shirts, is linked to the necessity of the prime aims, revolving around their application to Daisy. He creates this illusion that he has everything, but what he doesn't have is her. He's unable to let go of that, and that follows him through the illusion, even ending in his death. More about that in due course. What's interesting is that he always wanted to be rich, even as a youth, but his love affair with young Daisy brought a new urgency to that. And he utilised the opportunity presented by Prohibition to enter the world of organised crime, which then made him fabulously rich. He didn't, of course, because it's all manufactured, comprehend the difference between old rich and new rich, which shaped Daisy's attitude towards him and became a threat to control. The problem was that, like certain narcissists, no matter how rich he became, he couldn't transcend the issue with his class. When Daisy states rich girls don't marry poor boys, that's as much about class as it is about money. We only actually meet him by chapter 3. In the first two chapters, they're used to build up a picture of him. We hear about him as distant, aloof, reclusive, haughty behaviours, the host of the most sumptuous parties on Long Island, which he holds every weekend. His guests are the powerful and famous men and the most beautiful women of New York, all, of course, utilised for character trait acquisition. The narcissist believes that they belong to those appropriate circles, that they are with the powerful, with the famous, with the beautiful. There's confirmation of his criminality, and that he is shown to be smitten by Daisy, which of course is linked to his need to control her. He changes his name from James Gatz to J. Gatsby, the chameleon nature of the narcissist, and he is able to pursue his dream because his narcissism provides him with the drive to do so. A non-narcissist functions with a realistic sense of self and realistic hopes and aspirations. But in the narcissism causes the narcissist to see the world through a lens with images of perfection and omnipotence. Two major themes constitute the world lens of J. Gatsby. One is the theme of perfection, which is expressed in his capacity for idealizing himself and Daisy to an extreme. The idealized Gatsby's perfection is manifested in the belief that as a son of God, as I mentioned earlier, he's entitled to be exploitative in any way and to any extent consistent with his idealizations. The other theme that appears is that of omnipotency, which is expressed in his belief that as a son of God, he can control time, which is demonstrative of magical thinking and illusion. When he meets and falls in love with Daisy, but as you know, it's the narcissistic form of love, it's not based upon emotional empathy, he commits himself to the following of a grail. It's the green light, and that symbolises the idealised Daisy. Early in the summer, Nick observes Gatsby standing on his lawn looking across the bay at the green grail light that symbolises Daisy. He lifts his hands in worship. In worshipping the Grail as if it were a light emanating from the idealised Daisy, Gatsby's really worshipping himself in the mirror of Daisy's symbolism. Remember, people are just in effect mirrors that the narcissist holds themselves up to admire themselves. You are the conduits by which we achieve the image that we require, and that's particularly the case when it comes to children and intimate partners. Gatsby, like any narcissist, engages in self-worship. And at the end of the summer, when Daisy rejects him and disappears behind the barricade of Buchanan wealth, which threatens his sense of control, this Grail light also disappears. Nick states that on the night before his death, Gatsby was clutching at some last hope for Daisy's call. By the afternoon of the next day, Gatsby probably didn't believe it would come, and therefore he might not even no longer cared. Although Nick says on the last page of the novel that Gatsby believed in the green light. If in the last hours of his life he no longer believes that Daisy will call or cares about whether or not she will, then it follows that he no longer believes in the Grail. There's no evidence in the novel that Gatsby feels any moral conflict about urging Daisy to marry him, to marry into a life that's actually supported by an illusion and by criminal activity. He has no concerns about misleading her in that regard, has no concerns about ensuring that she belongs to him, even if it is built upon lies and morally abhorrent behaviours. He's entitled to want this because he simply believes, like any narcissist, that he is entitled to want this. What the narcissist wants must come into being, and you must not only understand that, you must be ready and apprehensive of the delivery of such a want. It is of crucial importance to note that Gatsby evinces no conscious sense of guilt for deceiving Daisy. Furthermore, there's no hint in the novel that he feels any guilt unconsciously either. Gatsby's a show-off, demonstrating his grandiosity. It is epic in terms of the way that he engages in the narcissistic trait of showmanship. He has no genuine emotional contact with Daisy, and he compensates for this deficiency, as the narcissist invariably does, by making exploitative demands upon Daisy and on the world in general. Exploitiveness with regard to women appears early in Gatsby's life. In his mid-teens, he knew women early, and he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. When he first met Daisy, he took what he could get. He had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security, misleading her, again showing her what she wanted to see, the creation of the illusion, and he let her believe that he was a person from much the same stratum as herself. The way that he exploited her is, of course, his own self-absorption, his absence of any moral compunction, and the necessity by which he has no emotional empathy. His sense of entitlement is a huge force in his character. This justifies his grandiosity as well as the way that he exploits. The most extreme expression of his grandiosity has to do with his parentage, which his imagination had never really accepted. Much in the way that this one's wife rejected her father because he no longer serves a purpose, the background that J. Gatsby had is one that he rejects. He cannot stand the fact that he came from poverty. He cannot stand the fact that his family came from a particular place which was not representative of the way that he wanted to be seen. He instead sprang from his Platonic conception as being a son of God. This quality in him has a specific grandiose focus. His father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar and meretricious beauty. He has this inflated religious theme which is elaborated in the statement that to this conception he was faithful to the end. As I've explained in other videos, the appropriation of God and godliness is seen with certain narcissists, and perhaps embodies more than anything the sense of grandiosity and entitlement. When Gatsby tells Nick it is God's truth that he's been educated at Oxford, like all his ancestors, that's not just an ordinary lie that you're hearing, but the fact that he has to reference it to being God's truth demonstrates his grandiosity and the religious theme once again by utilisation of the word God. Whether or not Gatsby's telling the truth about his ancestry and his heroic war record doesn't matter. The point is that when he tells Nick about it, he's using Nick as a conduit in order to see Daisy again, and he doesn't want Nick to think that he is just some nobody because he has to matter. Because all of the time the recognition of the other people matters to Gatsby because of his narcissism. He doesn't have that self-sufficiency. He exists purely as a consequence of the reactions and responses of those around him. He wants Daisy to see his house. He wants to triangulate her with it, which he keeps full of celebrated people, special objects. These are just that, objects in his universe of gaudiness, triangulation with object. Given his poor sense of reality and his grandiosity, it's neatly appropriate that his mansion is actually an imitation, and a colossal one at that. The note inviting Nick to a party there is signed by Gatsby in a majestic hand. Grandiosity again. He projects onto Daisy a royal status. To him she is high in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl, which is demonstrative, of course, of the way that he idealizes her. Gatsby is extremely adept at imbuing his exploitiveness with a romanticism that Nick is drawn to, thus enabling him to control. Like the typical narcissist, he presents with a surface that is charming and engaging, but beneath the surface there's coldness and ruthlessness. Nick says that when he first met him, Gatsby produced a smile with a quality of eternal reassurance in it, cognitive empathy. It concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favour. Nevertheless, beneath all of this, Gatsby is profoundly dishonest and manipulative, with Daisy both when he first meets her and later when they are reunited. He tells her serious lies in defending himself against Tom's revelations about how Gatsby has made his money. In short, in asking Daisy to leave Tom, lack of boundary recognition, interference with relationship, absence of emotional empathy, he is demonstrating his devious nature. He lies to her readily because she is the idealized object of his projections. He assumes that he doesn't need to tell Daisy the truth of who he actually was when they met 5 years ago and who he is now, a criminal. That is irrelevant. His narcissism pushes that to one side. If he truly loved her, exhibiting emotional empathy, he would want genuine intimacy with her. But of course, intimacy means relinquishing control, and as you know, control is a key part of the prime aims being pursued by the narcissist. Being intimate would also mean delivering the truth of what he is, and Gatsby does not want Daisy to know the truth of what he is, for he is a criminal with a poor education and a background of impoverished and successful farm people, and he must jettison that, because that background is a threat to his control and would diminish his ability to control Daisy. When Nick says to Gatsby, "You can't repeat the past," Gatsby is astounded at what he apparently regards as Nick's naivety. "Can't repeat the past?" he cries. "Why, of course you can." Narcissists typically believe that they can control time, for time presents threats to control. Therefore, it's often the case, in order to nullify that threat to control, that the narcissist attempts to go through the same thing in order to regain that control, even if such action wouldn't be supported by logic. What Gatsby wants in this regard is for himself and Daisy to be in Louisville again, in love, and then to be married from her house, just as it was 5 years ago. Controlling time by repeating an experience would be an attempt on Gatsby's part to stop and reverse time, demonstrative of magical thinking and grandiosity. Accordingly, Gatsby talked a lot about the past. He wanted to return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly. His belief that he can delete the present and restore the idealized past demonstrates his grandiosity, his deluded nature, the magical thinking, all driven to enable him to assert control. Nick is probably right in surmising that on the last day of his life, Gatsby no longer cared whether Daisy would call or not. The tone of the text at this point suggests that Gatsby is grieving during the last hours of his life, but he won't be grieving over Daisy. Of course, he has not got the capacity to do so, save where he would create the impression of doing so in order to control others. When the appliance is lost, the narcissist mourns not the loss of the appliance in itself, but rather the loss of appliance, namely the loss of what that appliance does for the narcissist. The narcissist is irritated by the loss of something that did something for them. It's not the fact that they have gone, that that person has died, but it is the fact that they are no longer able to do what is required of them for the furtherance of the narcissist aims. A revealing fact about Gatsby's behaviour during the last hours of his life is that he tells Nick the truth about his past, about his identity. Why does he do that? He has been lying to Nick repeatedly. Is this a confession? Is it a wish to atone? At least perhaps to himself for a life of lies? Absolutely not. As a narcissist, he has no remorse. It's simply another manipulation deployed to control Nick in the last hours of Gatsby's life. Nick's correct that in a way he's unaware of, in believing that on the last day of his life Gatsby remains faithful. He no longer cares about Daisy, then he's only faithful to the image of himself that he created by way of illusion. And it's this self that lives for the image of perfection. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together, says Nick, and at this point Gatsby's face broke into that radiant and understanding smile. But Nick is just a satellite mirror, a bit part appliance. Gatsby apparently regards Nick as being important enough to be told the truth of his story, but he completely disregards Nick's advice that he goes into hiding for a while, nullification of threat to control. Gatsby enjoys Nick's praise for it shows he's under control and provides him with fuel. At this point, facing the loss of the fantasy, rather than give up his fantasy idea of who he is, generated by his narcissism forming the construct, the narcissist would rather expire so that the fantasy ideal remains intact. In essence, he'd rather die than lose the fantasy ideal. We see with J. Gatsby his huge sense of entitlement, his absence of emotional empathy for those he has repeatedly used, strung along and manipulated, the complete absence of any sense of accountability for his behaviours. Indeed, he'd rather in effect die than acknowledge his failure to account for his behaviours. He exhibits rampant grandiosity and magical thinking with regard to the idea of who he is and his repeated pursuit and hoovering of Daisy. The haughty disregard he shows for those around him, who are mere conduits to the pursuit of his ideal, a smorgasbord of manipulations, and someone resplendent with the various aspects of the narcissistic dynamic. J. Gatsby is clearly a narcissist in literature. I'm HG Tudor. Thank you for listening.